I like routine. All you'd have to do is ask my wife. She'll tell you I generally like to get up at the same time. I like to exercise. If I don't get my exercise in early in the morning, I tend to get antsy. I eat the same thing for breakfast every morning. I like to come to my office and I like to brew a cup of coffee and have a couple of cups of really good hot coffee first thing in the morning. And when that stuff doesn't happen, when that routine is upset, I can get really, my routine's upset. I can struggle with that. Well, sometimes that happens on the spiritual level too. Because some of us, we struggle with the fact that we really like religious routine, religious activity, sacramentalism, rituals, things we do that we'd say, I know at this part of the service we say this prayer, at this part of the service we repeat this, and this we do all this together, and this is going to happen. And we like that kind of stuff in churches. And lots of religions are like that. Not just Christianity. There's lots of religions that have that. But there's an interesting point. Nowhere in the New Testament does it ever indicate that you and I as Christians, and the church in particular, has any kind of regular rituals that we do apart from sharing communion, which he says as often as you do this. Doesn't tell us how often to do this. I was just in a pastor's meeting the other day where they were talking about some churches do it once a year. Some churches do it every month that has a fifth Sunday, so that happens about 4 or 5 times a year. Some churches do it every other month. Some churches do it once a month. Some churches do it every week. I mean, the point I'm trying to get at is, and these are all churches that share a lot in common, and yet they're not even settled on that particular one thing that actually has kind of we've been told to practice. And this all has something to do with the way we relate to life with our soul. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we're trying to answer the question, what is man? And we're trying to draw the distinction between the soul and the spirit. And if you remember, as we introduced this, the spirit is the part with which we relate to things objectively. We relate to God, we relate to things that are going on, and it's just objective. The soul is subjective. It's relating to experience. It has senses and emotions that work with this way. And the Word of God, as the Apostle Paul, I think he's the one that wrote Hebrews. If you disagree with me, just give me a pass on that for the moment. He doesn't tell us who wrote it, so we'll be okay with that. But whoever wrote the book of Hebrews, this individual tells us here that the Word of God can help you distinguish between the soul and spirit. Why? Because the souls of these believers were struggling with the fact that they wanted to continue in the rituals of Judaism. Not in order to be saved, because no one was ever saved through the rituals of Judaism. The rituals of Judaism made Israel different, but it gave them access to God. It gave them a place where they knew they could find God anytime, and it gave them the ability to say, I know that I can come to him because I've gone through the cleansing rituals, I've brought the proper offerings, I can come to the priest, and I can talk to them. But see, all that's gone. And these believers want to continue with this, and they don't need to anymore. Because as we saw yesterday, we now have Jesus Christ, who is our high priest, who has already sat down at the Father's right hand, and we come to that throne, and it's a throne of grace, not a throne of law, not a throne of works, not a throne of merits, not a throne of ritual, a throne of grace, where he allows us to come without regard to whether or not we are worthy or unworthy. In Hebrews chapter 6, as he's writing to these people that are struggling with letting go of the law and just being Christians, he says in verse 11, and we desire that each one of you show the same diligence, so that you might realize the full assurance of the hope unto the end, so that you not be sluggish or slow of hearing, but become imitators of those who through faith and patience they are inheriting. Our word over here, it's a present participle in the Greek, and he's saying Right now they're inheriting. He's not saying they're going to inherit in the future. It's right now that there's a promise that he's given us of inheriting. And there's 2 promises he's already clearly given us in this letter, even 3. One of them is Christ our high priest can come to our cry for help. Number 2, Christ our high priest is set down at the Father's right hand, and we have access there. And with that, number 3 is that we can go to that throne of grace and find rest. So, answer to a cry of help. Number 1, access to God, and rest. We've already have 3 sets of promises that you don't have to wait for the sweet by and by for. You can be experiencing those right now. And those, he says, ties to a promise that God makes, and he talks about the fact that God swore. God doesn't have to swear, because then he's actually able to say down here, I'm going to come down to verse 17. In the same way, God desiring even more to show to the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose, interposed or mediated then with an oath. So that by 2 unchangeable things. What's one? Well, he swore an oath. That's 1. What's the other one? In which it is impossible for God to lie. That's 2. All God had to do was say, I'm going to do it. He didn't have to swear an oath, but that gave us, in our minds, 2 unchangeable things. We who have taken refuge or fled to him would have strong encouragement and take hold of the hope set before us. What's the hope set before us? The hope that we can find access to God and rest at the throne of grace. That's in chapter 4. We haven't really looked at that. But he says this hope then we have as an anchor of the soul. What's the hope? The hope that Christ is our high priest, the rest and the access to God. He says that'll anchor your soul. Now, back in chapter 2 of Hebrews, he said, if you're not paying attention to this great salvation we've got, and it is a great salvation, if you're not paying attention to it, you'll drift. And there are lots of us as believers that become so enamored with other stuff, maybe with religion, maybe with our church tradition, that we don't really pay attention to our great salvation, and we find ourselves drifting on down the stream. And as a result, the anchor for our soul isn't there, and we're being driven along by our soul rather than by what we know to be true. And there are Christians that attend churches, could be the church I attend to, although our church doesn't tend to have as much ritual, but we definitely have kind of orders and tradition a little bit that we practice, even whether we think we don't. But they're believers that they want to know that at this part of the service here, we're all going to say this prayer. At this part of the service, that we're all going to sing this song. At this part of the service. And they like the fact that there's this liturgy that they go through. They like that. And the interesting thing is if you go through the letters of the New Testament, you don't find that. We don't find anywhere that the scriptures give a liturgy, an order that we actually have to follow. It only says do things in an orderly manner, not chaos. But it doesn't actually give an order for the things we specifically have to say and do. And so he says, that hope then, both sure and steadfast, one that is entered in within the veil. So he says this hope anchors our soul out there, and it anchors it firmly. And it's where Jesus Christ has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. See, this is now, I think this is the 3rd time in Hebrews that he has told us that Jesus is our high priest. He's the one, because he's there, that because of that, he has anchored our soul by providing us this access. He himself isn't the anchor. It doesn't say that. It says where he has entered. But it's because he's entered there that he has given us access to God in a place where we can rest with God. Rest from what? Rest from trying to be good enough to approach God. Under Israel, they had things where I touched somebody yesterday. I touched somebody that was dead. I did this or that. My wife and I had sexual relations last night, and now I'm unclean and I have to go through a washing ritual before I can approach God. A family member died and now I'm unclean. A woman went through her cycle, now she's unclean. Or she had a child and she's unclean. Just think of all the things that made people unclean. And they had to go through all these rituals to be clean and to be good enough and to bring the right offerings. And we don't have to do that. Our souls can find rest. We can find rest because Jesus has become everything we need to have access to God. This is pretty amazing when you stop to think about this. And he says it anchors our soul. Sometimes we can think that you can throw an anchor over the boat, but if you've done any kind of boating at all, and I've only done a little bit with my dad when I was a kid, when you toss the anchor over, anchors, they don't all hold because some of it depends on the anchor and some of it depends on the bottom. And sometimes in the right conditions with enough wind or current and not a good hold for the anchor, a boat can be driven along. But our hope is, what does he say? Sure and steadfast. It's one where that anchor is firmly planted where it needs to be. And when there is tempest and there are struggles, whatever it is that would move us around, and our soul, let's say our soul is what's moving us around. In here we know, oh, this is the way God's doing it. This is the way it is. I'm good. But our soul's going, yeah, but what about this? And we struggle. Guess what? He says this can anchor our soul. So our soul doesn't have to drag us around, doesn't have to be the thing that gets us blown and drift like that. And you know what? Maybe you're one of these people, like me, like lots of people, that there are certain traditions, certain things that you've grown up with, maybe grown up in a church, maybe grown up in another religion, but you've struggled with the fact that giving up traditions and letting go of those things is hard. And your soul, your emotions that likes those senses. Think about these people. They were used to going up to the temple and they would smell incense burning up there. They would smell sacrifices being burned. They would listen to the choirs of singers that were singing up there. They'd listen to the priests praying. They would see all these sights and all these senses that really feed the soul. And now they go to church and there's no incense. Oh yeah, we do sing in churches, but we sing a lot more than the early churches sang, according to church tradition, and even according to the scriptures. And so we're not burning sacrifices. There is some singing. And traditionally, the early church didn't have a lot of ritual that it followed, so it was all a very different experience. That was hard for these people to give up, just like it's hard for us 2,000 years down the road sometimes to let go of stuff that, you know what, all it does is just make your soul feel better, but it doesn't really give you any better connection in any way with God. Let the truth that Jesus Christ is your high priest allows you to come into the very presence of God there. Let that give you rest. Let that give you boldness in coming to God. And let that anchor your soul in Him, where I encourage you every day, have a good day in the Lord. That's in Him. And of course, as always, I want to thank you for joining me.